Hello, I'm Dr. Scott Jordan, cognitive psychologist, philosopher from Illinois State University. Thanks for watching my video. So what I'm going to talk about is wild systems theory as a 21st century coherence ontology for the science of consciousness. There are some things I have to admit up front. I love science. However, I also love the taste of ice cream. That's a problem because science currently makes assumptions about what people are that prevent the taste of ice cream from being necessarily real. Now, this of course makes me very sad, but given that my sadness is just as unreal as the taste of ice cream, who cares anyway? My point is, are there different ways to talk about truth, reality, and the taste of ice cream? So I'm going to do this by starting off with a story. The story is called A Boy, a Bracelet, and the Snake. And basically, a boy's riding his bike down the street. He sees a bracelet, turns around, pulls over, bends over, picks up the bracelet, and it turns into a snake. What I do then is I ask my students after I tell them the story to describe it using the concept real. So the first answers usually go like this. Well, the boy thought it was a bracelet, but it was really a snake. Or the boy misperceived the snake as a bracelet. And then I say, well, is there anything real about the bracelet? After a bit of prodding, I usually get an answer something like, well, the boy really had a bracelet experience, just like people really have dreams. But when I push them on it, it always comes to be the case that the snake is more real than the bracelet. I propose this contradictory use of the concept real is still at work in cognitive science, and in our case, the science of consciousness. Often we talk about trees in the forest and whether or not they make sounds. The idea here is that there are trees outside of us and there are representational trees within us. We see those trees outside of us by the trees in us. Those trees outside of us are experienced as being more real than the tree that's inside of us. Therefore, we call them big R versus little r. We then call them really real trees or sort of real trees. And then when we get sophisticated, we start calling them objective trees versus subjective trees. And then when we get super sophisticated, observer independent trees versus observer dependent trees. Now, the point I want to make here is that reality is being defined in terms of how it's different from experience. Now, this distinction between experience and reality is much older than René Descartes, but we'll just start with him for convenience sake this evening. Descartes starts off trying to figure out the only thing he can't doubt, and the only thing he can't doubt is that he can doubt. Therefore, cognito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. And in Descartes' ontology, the physical world is real, the spiritual world is real, and truth then is the degree to which these two realities correspond. And of course, Descartes knows that the physical is real because God made it that way. Now, John Locke comes along later and says, wait a minute, one doesn't need to conceptualize the subjective as being spiritual. One can also conceptualize it as being part of nature, just like my body. This then allows us to have a science of man, i.e. psychology. Truth, however, is still seen as the degree of correspondence between the objective and the subjective. Of course, then everyone knows David Hume came along shortly thereafter and said, wait a minute, one should be radically skeptical about the existence of an objective realm that lies behind and causes the subjective. For if all we know are the internal impressions external reality causes within us, all we really have access to are those internal impressions. Thus, it's logically incoherent to claim that I can know what's outside of me by what it causes inside of me. Unless, of course, your name is Nero and Morpheus offers you a drug-induced means of overcoming radical skepticism. So how do correspondence theorists address radical skepticism? Well, what guys like Descartes did was they nested the correspondence relation between the subjective and the objective within a larger scale assumed reality that guaranteed the veridicality of the correspondence relation. In Descartes' case, He believed that although he could doubt physical reality, he couldn't believe that God would actually create a physical reality that didn't match up to his spiritual knowing self. Bishop Berkeley took a slightly different approach and argued that we know reality corresponds to our experiences because we all live in God's mind. John Locke says, hey man, I just want a science of man. Darwin comes along later, The Origin of Species, and changes our description of the subjective. The human part of this, or our subjectivity, is an evolved form of physical stuff. This supports the rise of realism and physicalism. Realism is the idea that you define reality in terms of that which is independent of observers, and physicalism is the idea that everything that exists is physical. Later on, then you have guys like Helmholtz putting forward the anti-vitalist pact, the idea that no other forces than the common physical and chemical ones are active within organisms. People, therefore, are physical, chemical, biological systems. And the reality of the subjective has to be spelled out in physical, chemical, biological terms. Truth in this framework is still the degree of correspondence between the external physical world and the internal physical world. So the question then is, how do contemporary correspondence theorists attempt to overcome radical skepticism? And I'm going to argue that they do the same thing Descartes did. They nest the correspondence relation within an assumed larger scale reality that guarantees the veridicality of the correspondence relation. And that assumed larger scale reality is the evolved physical world. So I know it sounds somewhat anti-scientific to claim that the evolved physical world is an assumption. Here's what I mean. Calling the evolved physical world an assumption does not mean that reality does not exist or that it's purely subjective. When I claim that the evolved physical world is an assumption, what I'm saying is that referring to reality as being physical is neither scientifically nor philosophically necessary. Rather, referring to reality as being physical is a centuries-old byproduct of our attempt to describe what we are in observable, testable, non-spiritual ways. And as a result, when we make the physicalist claim that reality is physical and further assert the realist claim that it is reality because it is mind or observer independent, we do the following. We reify the correspondence-driven, logically incoherent epistemic gap between reality and observers. We also compel scientists then to feel they have to bridge this assumed epistemic gap via principles such as representation construction, i.e. indirect realism, or affordance detection, i.e. direct realism. An alternative framework to correspondence is known as the Coherence Model. And in the Coherence Model, reality is an internally related unity. What this means is that all things are about and constituted of all things. All objects are constitutive of their subjects and vice versa. The notion that reality is an internally related unity is known as the doctrine of internal relations. That is, the relations between entity A and B are actually constitutive of what A and B are. Idealist philosophers such as Hegel proposed views consistent with internal relations in order to avoid radical skepticism. They did so instead of defining reality dialectically in relation to experience in terms of how reality is different from experience, as is the case in the correspondence view. As a result, science was not tasked with providing a context-independent description of the intrinsic objective properties of reality because there are no properties that are intrinsic, that is, independent of all context and therefore independent of the rest of reality. Being universal does not mean being context independent. Just because gravity is universal does not mean it is context independent. But who really believes in intrinsic properties anyway? Who believes that reality reduces to context independent things that are as they are independently of all reality? Jarmer in 2002, for example, argued that particles obtain their inertial mass by moving through the Higgs field. And what is the Higgs field? It is a field that permeates all of reality. What this means is that mass is a relational property, not a property of a particle intrinsically to itself. Bauer, 2011, argues that grounding mass in the Higgs field is equivalent to external grounding, What this means is grounding the property of mass externally to the particle, i.e. relationally. Hari 1986 argued for ultra-grounding, which is the idea that properties exist as being grounded in reality as a whole. Schaefer 2003 and Delmet 1989 argued there may be no fundamental level to reality altogether, and Pryor et al. In 1982 argued the global groundedness thesis, which basically argues that all properties are grounded in reality as a whole. Rosen developed the notion of relational versus intrinsic biology, the idea that biological systems are actually close to efficient cause, which means that in order to have a science of living systems, one cannot pay attention to simply one level of order, because the causality one finds at that level of order necessitates an explanation of the higher levels of order that phenomenon is nested within. So what would a coherence framework look like that doesn't describe what we are in terms of relational versus intrinsic properties, physical versus mental properties, or objective versus subjective properties? People who call themselves coherence philosophers or coherence theorists argue that coherence means lack of contradiction. Most coherentists are referring to the coherence of descriptions. What justifies the formation of any new belief is that the doxastic move in question improves the subject's explanatory position overall and/or increases the explanatory coherence of the subject's global set of beliefs. That's like in 2012. But being a coherence theorist about theories allows one to simultaneously be a correspondence theorist about truth and reality. For example, I can believe that I know about external trees because of the internal impressions they cause within me. That would be my correspondence theory of reality. And I could say that my experiences are true to the extent that they correspond to external reality. That would be my correspondence theory approach to truth. And then I could also be a coherence theorist about generating a set of statements that describes that coherence framework. My point is, being a coherence theorist about models doesn't solve the snake bracelet question. It doesn't overcome radical skepticism. So what does it mean to be a coherence theorist about truth and reality? So I'm going to start to introduce wild systems theory. Wild systems theory conceptualizes reality as a self-organizing energy transformation hierarchy. It's self-organizing in the sense that what we find in that energy transformation hierarchy comes from within that hierarchy. There isn't something outside of reality that comes in and makes things what they are. Hierarchy means that higher level energy transformation systems, such as herbivores, for example, consume lower quality energy transformation systems, such as plants. What I want to point out here is now we're talking about living systems in reality as an energy transformation context, energy transformation system. We're not talking about physical, mental systems, and actually that's the entire point. So the person who made probably the clearest statement on what a self-sustaining energy transformation system might be like is Stuart Kauffman and his notion of autocatalysis, the notion that in the prebiotic soup, the ratio of diverse chemical types to possible reactions reached a threshold in which certain chemical reactions now started producing their own catalysts. What this means then is that living systems become self-metabolizing systems. The interaction between A and B produces a product that actually feeds back into the A-B reaction as a catalyst. The way I like to describe this is that the work produces products that sustain the work, what I call self-sustaining work. Now, within this energy transformation hierarchy, emergent systems give rise to new contexts that are for the emergence of new systems. So for example, once there's a plethora of plants, that gives rise to the possibility of herbivores, which in turn gives rise to the possibility of carnivores, which in turn gives rise to the possibility of Homo sapiens, followed by credit card companies. The point here is that the fuel source dictates the consumer. What's going on here is that evolution is packing more and more structure, more and more constraints into what self-sustaining systems are. Reality then is increasingly being described in terms of context, not in terms of physical versus mental. The new systems that emerge in this hierarchy are themselves autocatalytic. and different researchers have tapped into this idea at different points in history. So for example, Donald Hebb taught us that neurons that fire together wire together, what he called the cell assembly. What we know now is that when neurons generate action potentials, it gives rise to transcription processes in the nucleus of the neuron, which then gives rise to synapse formation. So in a sense, the work of being a neuron, of generating action potentials, gives rise, sustains the neuron being a neuron by having more synapses be generated and therefore get caught up in more reactions with other neurons. Of course, Jerry Edelman took this notion and applied it to the brain as a whole with this notion of neuronal Darwinism. Those neural networks that we keep are the ones that we use. B.F. Skinner actually tapped into the idea of self-sustaining work with his theory of positive reinforcement. The idea is that consequences of behavior that actually work to keep that behavior within the organism's repertoire are positively reinforcing. So when this gentleman climbs his tree, picks the apple, eats the apple, the chemicals released by the eating of the apple sustain all the systems that gave rise to this individual's ability to actually grab the apple in the first place. And then Mark Bickert in 2001 made the case that all of these nested levels of self-sustaining autocatalytic work are recursively autocatalytic, i.e. mutually sustaining. Now, the point I want to make here is how we can get the notion of subjectivity and consciousness built into this idea of self-sustaining work. And the idea is that self-sustaining systems are embodiments of the contexts from which they emerged. They can be modeled, therefore, as internally related embodied context. My bones, my lungs, my heart are all about the constraints that need to be addressed to propel a mass through a gravity field. What this means is these systems are naturally and necessarily about the contexts that they embody. There therefore is no epistemic divide. There's no epistemic gap between an organism and its environment. The internal processes are naturally and necessarily meaningful because they are about the embodied context. They are about the context they embody. Self-sustaining embodied context avoids both the notion of epistemic gaps and contextual gaps. All phenomena reside within context, therefore are naturally and necessarily about context. Meaning, phenomenology, consciousness, value, these are all the natural necessary aboutness of which embodied contexts are constituted. Truth in this kind of system is determined by coherence, by the lack of contradiction in our moment-to-moment world of aboutness, i.e. our moment-to-moment world of experience. Because it can't be correspondence, because it's logically incoherent. There can be no final external reality to which experience corresponds. What there can be is modulation of my aboutness, while I simultaneously modulate the aboutness within which I am nested. Complex systems theory deserves a wild ontology that is consistent with the coherence of the idealist philosophers and contemporary philosophers of science. That's cool, Scott. But how does any of this matter? Well, I'll tell you what. You know what? The taste of ice cream is worth fighting for. Now I am happy, and it's necessarily real. Thank you. Thank you so much for watching my talk. If you'd like to send me a question, please do so to jsjorda@ilstu.edu. You can also look me up on my university webpage. Here's a link to a talk I gave at the Anticipation and Anticipatory Systems Conference, Humans Meet Artificial Intelligence. That you're generating unconscious foot anticipations is when they don't work. You can also find me at the Dark Loops Production channel on YouTube, where I post podcasts about live life, science, and all things pop culture.
For a very long time and has been, I think it was like 10 or plus years without ever dying. And someone who sort of broke through without it being sort of this revolutionary.
You can also find an interview I did on Dr. John Leader's podcast, Mind, Self, Body.
Becomes more likely that we'll achieve that.
Right.
So it seems to be that navigation.
Yeah, I like the idea of navigation. And last but not least, a San Diego Comic-Con at Home presentation, Wakanda Forever, The Psychology of Black Panther.
T'Challa specifically, but also just many people in Wakanda in general, show in their actions that there's no fundamental conflict between science and spirituality.
Again, thanks for coming to my talk.